All right. Hello, everyone. I hope the sound is somewhat working. Okay, now everything's working. So first of all, thanks everyone for coming. It's quite nice to see some familiar faces, but also to see so many unfamiliar faces. Thanks so much for Maxon for making this happen and for letting me be on stage today and tell you some hopefully interesting things. I will give you a quick personal introduction before I start with my presentation, because I think most of you probably don't know me yet. I'm Yannik Wenk. I work at someform Studio, as you can see. And at someform, I mainly do 3D design, art direction, and basically anything else that needs to be done in our day-to-day production workflow. Before I joined someform, I was doing freelance for quite a bit, but for me personally, it felt like I needed to see some fresh air and to be able to grow as a designer and as an artist further. So I'm super happy to work with someform now, and even more happy to be on stage for them today. There's a personal story I would like to tell because I thought that was quite funny. I was already to FMX once, and that was in 2019. And I can still remember that because back then we were there with university, because back then I was still studying. And our professors basically told us, oh, you have to go to FMX to see the professionals talking and to learn new stuff, make connections, and figure out if that's something you might eventually want to do for a living after you graduate. And when I posted to my Instagram story that I will be here today presenting, a lot of my former co-students reached out to me and were like, oh, this is so crazy that you're on stage just a couple of years later. So it's still like sitting here right now is kind of surreal to me, and it's quite a personal full circle moment for me right now. I also got told it helps with the nervousness to put a funny GIF in your presentation. I don't know if that was good advice, but I thought, why not try it out? Before I really dive into my presentation, I want to give you a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about today. I first of all want to introduce us as someform Studio, give you a quick background, who we are, what we're doing, where we come from, before then diving into the first bigger portion of the presentation, which is how and why we work, kind of explaining the process beyond our projects, because I feel like that process separates us quite a bit from a lot of other studios working in the industry. And then the second big portion of the presentation will be a showcase of the Google Design Development project that we did mid last year, which was one of the most fun projects I've worked on so far. So I want to give you a quick showcase of a lot of unreleased R&D that we did back then that no one else has seen yet. So you're the first one now. Before then, giving a wrap up, some famous last words. And also, if any one of you plan to leave the room now, don't do it, because at the end there's a giveaway happening from Maxon. So if you wanted to leave now, you have a reason to not leave. But well, let's first of all start by quickly explaining what someform is, because for us, we always feel it's quite important to give a quick explanation, because most people in this audience and most people online might still know us as Foam Studio. And there are a lot of misunderstandings happening. For example, when I was starting at someform and I posted our first project into my Instagram story, like 4 or 5 people reached out to me and were like, this looks nice, but the whole Instagram feed is just a rip-off of Foam. And we were like, yeah, well, because someform is Foam's predecessor. Foam got closed a few years ago, and then someform got founded in late 2020. So to avoid any misunderstandings, Foam is now someform. In case I will show some of the work that was originally Foam Studio, but it's the same team, just under a new name. This is the text on our website, and it's really complicated. Someform is a Berlin-based design and branding studio specialized in conceptual and creative development of complex 3D design systems. And then there's an even more complicated sentence afterwards. And if you read through it, it's an amazing sentence for a website biography, but what does it actually mean? And while preparing or finishing the preparation of this presentation in the train, it occurred to me that if you would want to be mean, you could almost say that this presentation is just a 45-minute explanation of this sentence. But this really doesn't sound spectacular, so I'm glad I chose a different title for the presentation. But basically, I want to try to explain what that means and how our process for projects is. And that's what we're going to do right now. First of all, I want to start by this basic motto or mantra we have going on for pretty much every project we have. And that's everything can be a design system. This is quite vague, and some of you will be like, yeah, obviously everything can be a design system, and some of you will be like, no, that's not true, not everything can be a design system. And on the wild train of thought I will get rolling right now, I want to convince you that this is actually true. Let's see if that works. Let's start by a rather simple statement, and that's we can make sense of wildly different shapes because we understand their function from experience. And this train of thought is something I will just like quickly introduce and then come back to it later and explain it properly. But to us, it's really important when approaching projects to look at objects not as objects with their function, but just as shapes with no functional purpose. Because if you approach projects like that, something like this suddenly is not a technical device, but it's just some form of assortment of random shapes with lighting and a simple backdrop. You have no category assigned to it in your brain. You can really focus on these shapes. And that shows that besides our abstract work, which I will go into detail in a later stage of the presentation, we also do a lot of product photography in 3D. Same concept though. And while these two disciplines, product photography and abstract 3D work, sound really, really different, they're actually not very different at all. And let me explain why. The only difference between those two categories is that one shape already has a category in your brain, and I will go in depth to these category things later, and the other category does not. For this project, for example, this is a project for Ledger, and we collaborated with the Berlin-based graphic design agency Hello Me, which was an amazing process to collaborate with them because we pretty much had all creative freedom. And as you can see, your brain probably can connect this with something, because you know a display, you know what a display looks like, and you know what a USB stick looks like. We, especially like all of us, have seen USB sticks thousands of times in our lives, for the better or worse. But because of that, you can kind of figure out what it is. And for some of you who didn't figure out what it is, it's actually a physical storage solutions for cryptocurrency. So basically a fancy USB stick to put Bitcoin on or something. And because we have these elements that we can refer to in our brain, we can label it as a technology product. But I see a lot of confused faces. So let's take a step back. Let's go back to baby. And this is a really weird slide, but I still decided to keep it in the presentation. But it actually makes sense, because every time a child encounters a table, it stores the experience of looking at said table. And the child then, based on similarities between the tables, abstract the properties and functions to form the internal category in its brain of a table. Let me explain that. This is a table. And we understand what defines a table. There are parameters that cannot be changed, otherwise it will fall out of the category of a table. But there are aspects that can be changed, and it still gets categorized as a table in our brain. So ultimately, there's a mixture of rules that cannot be broken. If you look at this table, it's vastly different from the other ones I just showed you, despite you would say it's really similar, it's a table, but if you really think about it, it's vastly different. The legs are different, the connection of the legs to the tabletop are different, and even the tabletop itself is really different. And these guidelines offer a range of flexibility for the category of a table in your brain. And then there's this guy, which is super weird, because it doesn't really have the properties of this table or this table or this table. It doesn't have 4 separate legs, for example, but your brain still immediately recognizes it as a table. And that's the flexibility I was talking about. To showcase that, we worked with New Tendency for years by now. New Tendency is a Berlin-based furniture company, for those of you who don't know them, and it's always amazing to work with them. And I bet they have a huge wealth of thought around that exact same concept, because what I just described is basically what they're doing. They're trying to build furniture that makes your brain categorize it immediately, but still try to bend the rule set so it doesn't look predictable. For example, for this side table thing. And while our task was mainly in this project or every other project for New Tendency to find the perfect visual representation of their work, we do share the common conceptual view with them on shape language and what that means. And to us, it's really fascinating that a lot of their products bend the expectations of how they should look like. For example, this is a bar stool. And if I would ask any of you to draw a bar stool on a piece of paper or to model it in 3D for that matter, probably wouldn't look like this. But still your brain immediately knows it's a bar stool. So ultimately for them, it's always a question of how much can we abstract an object until it still gets the categorization in your brain right and still has the function, but doesn't look as you would predict. And that's basically how we approach most projects as well. For us, it's important to look at the product the same way we look at abstract shapes. So we don't look at the product with the intrinsic functionality behind, but we look at it as an abstract shape. And only through that way, we can really find an emotional connection to the shape and focus on what defines the shape and where its beauty lies. Also in those images, you can immediately recognize it's like a shelf situation going on, but we really try to focus on the shape itself instead of the proper function. This might still be a bit abstract, and no worries, I will go into detail down the line, but just to quickly tease this, we worked on a book with New Tendency end of last year in October or November, which is unfortunately not released yet. We would have loved to show it around today, but unfortunately it's not finished. We're still waiting on the post-processing, graphic design, editorial team to finish it. But here's just a really quick glimpse of what we did and how we tried to find a new visual language and a cohesive design world for New Tendency and their furniture to live in for the coming years, just how we did with the images I just showed you before in 2020. Before we dive into more conceptual stuff, I want to show you this, which is a funny representation of our workflow, because actually I mean, some of you might know our work and some of you are just getting to know it right now, but something that all of the people that we're talking with say is that our work probably doesn't live off of super crazy technical setups and super advanced techniques. It's more about really good and thought out design systems. And that's just our Figma board after like one or 2 weeks of work, because we really try to iterate really quickly and find a design system in a design world that works. And for that, it's incredibly important to iterate, which is amazing to then work with Cinema 4D, because as most of you might know, it really allows you to iterate so quickly and work with the software instead of against the software. Abstracting products is rather simple. I would argue that most of you pretty much do what I just explained on a day-to-day basis. But what if there is no product? What do you do if you can't focus on like predefined shapes? What do you do if there is no product? What if you work with no products? Then you use emotional abstraction. And that's something pretty much all of us already learned in school. But I feel like, especially when talking with people about this topic, I get the strange feeling that a lot of us just forget about it, or we learn to not use it due to whatever reason. Because even though we might not be able to fully identify an abstract shape as a predefined object in our minds, because we're missing the category, our brain still judges the object based on the exact same methods we use for objects that we already know. To keep this really, really simple, a sharp and pointy edge of a shape will always look rather dangerous, while a lot of rounded curves do convey a sensation of comfort. This is just the most basic example you could give. There are also a lot of other examples with colors, but you can also use this in an abstract way with animation. The way things behave can describe their character. And we can use those methods to communicate ideas and stories without ever having to show a real product. To show what I mean, that's exactly what we did for BCG like 1.5 years ago. And BCG, it's Boston Consulting Group. I don't know if some of you are familiar with them. It's one of the 3 or 4 major consulting groups in the world. They're a huge company. And our process for them, on one hand, is vastly different to the process of New Tendency and Ledger, but also quite the same. We always start with the traditional design development and then try to figure out how we can communicate the ideas and stories that we need to communicate. For this project, we didn't have any predefined shapes, so we had to come up with solutions by our own. For example, for this one, they have like 3 or 4 cornerstones of their company philosophy. And one of them is the cornerstone climate and sustainability. So we had to find a way to visually talk about climate and sustainability so the audience knows what's up without reading any text. So for this topic, we came up with a way to have like balancing shapes to show the fragility of climate and of sustainability. This might sound simple to you now when I explain it with with this one image and this one video, but if you're in the design process, this is actually a really interesting process to find out what you can use to convey the message. We also had the digital and AI topic we had to come up with a solution for. And for this, we used a stack of abstract objects inspired by the stacks of commands in a programming language to describe the problem-solving algorithms of BCG. And then probably the most fun one for us, at least, was the BCG core brand. And just to give you a quick introduction, without going into too much detail what BCG does, basically they're a consulting company. And for those of you who might not know what a consulting company does, basically there's a client or a company and they have a problem or a question or whatever. And then there's the consulting company, which has a huge wealth of knowledge about pretty much all topics you could imagine. And then the company or client approaches the consulting company for a solution for the said problem. That's really simple, and anyone of BCG would probably explain it way different than I did, but that's my understanding of what a consulting company does. And for the BCG core brand, so basically what they're doing at their core, we had to come up with an abstract visualization of problem solving. And for this, we used a really cluttered mess of objects and then forming this mess into really rigid and structured visual sculptures. We'll show you a few of them in animations later on. For example, we came up with something like this, which, especially in animation, works rather well. And as I just described or as I tried to describe by the methods you can use to communicate ideas and stories, especially with clips or videos like this, and it's not playing a second time. This is amazing. Oh, it plays a second time. We especially what I try to say is we especially try to use animation as a way to convey the story and idea. The way these objects behave is like we really try to focus on how they behave to convey the story. And now the funny thing is, all of the following images were generated procedurally. No one actually rendered those images. We built a software with actually Unreal Engine 5, and all of those images are rendered with the internal path tracer based on the rule set and the design system we established in Cinema 4D before that. And this enabled us to have a completely different workflow and to deliver a completely different set of deliverables to the client. None of this is traditionally rendered in 3D. All of this is generated from the software we developed. Here's just a quick overview of some of the final images we were able to generate with the software for the BCG core brand. And I don't want to go into detail about the automating design system topic in this talk because time is rather tight, and I think this is also, as of now, quite a niche topic. But I just want to quickly summarize our thoughts about this. Because basically, a good design system consists of visual rules, ranges of flexibility, and randomness. And rules, ranges of flexibility, and randomness, some of you might already make the connection, are also all things that are pillars of proceduralism. If you think about it, the Maxon noise we probably all use in our day-to-day workflow, at least I do like dozens of times a day. It consists of exactly that. It consists of rules, so the noise always looks contained in how it should look like. We have ranges of flexibility to adapt it to our use, and we also have randomness, basically speaking like the seed you can just click through until you find a noise that works for you. And these three things are the pillars of proceduralism, but also the pillars of a good design system that works for brands in 3D. So it was just logical for us to sooner or later connect both worlds and build something that can generate images based on the rule set we designed by itself. So this is the software we built. This is actually how it runs. It's just a fancy screen capture, but the software itself looks exactly like that and works exactly like that. And as you can see, we do have user input still, because obviously you can't just ship a random tool to a marketing team and there's one button they can press and weird stuff comes out of it. They do need control. But the funny thing about this now is that we offer them control, but because we designed the underlying design system, they can't really break the rules. Everything they do still looks like we intended it to look like. So without, as I said, without going into too much detail, we think there's a huge potential in generating software for clients similar to this, and we personally feel like that the demand for this is growing with every month, basically. But still, I want to make clear that what you just saw is not machine learning and is not AI. And that's quite important for me to clarify, because I also think AI is a topic a lot of the talks at FMX will be about. This talk won't be about AI, and the video you just saw is also not AI. It's just automated decision making. We give the software a rule set it can use to generate output, but it's not AI. Our approach, as I said, can be more described as automated decision making, and it heavily relies on the systematic approach of the design system we established. It's not a generate funky shit button. It really works how we intend it to work. And we do feel like there's huge potential in this. If you think about it, the demo I just showed you works with user input, but if you think about it, you could imagine a software that works without active user input and basically generates stuff based on passive user data that got collected through your cell phone, for example, and then just like gives you generated advertisement on your smartphone or something. So we're still in the midst of trying to figure out how we can use something like this in our workflow, but as I said, we don't have a finished opinion on that, but we think it's super exciting and still wanted to definitely show you what we're up to in that regard. And I feel like now you have a rough understanding of what we do and how we spend our days and why we choose the workflow we do. So I would like to take the rest of the presentation to talk about, as I said, one of the most fun projects I've worked on so far. It was for Google Design Development, and we were approached by Nando Costa, who was working at Google back then. I think some of you might know him still from his time at Microsoft. And he approached us, and he basically wanted us to not really deliver a set of images or movies. He just asked us to do explorations on how a design system for the new Android MaterialYou UI system could look like. And that's basically what we did. But before we jumped right into doing crazy stuff, we tried to remind us that in a novel, all words are there and our brain creates the image. But in an abstract animation or in abstract stills for that matter, the images are there, but our brain has to write the story. And usually that's where a lot of problems happen, because if you don't think your abstract stuff through, the brain of the audience will generate stuff that it shouldn't really generate. So to us, doing abstract animation, abstract work, abstract stills, whatever, is kind of like writing a book. And we really have to be careful of what we do so the audience or the viewer then has the right words in their mind. But still, this looks like we are spending so much time doing thinking in our day-to-day workflow, which is true on some days, but on most days we just do R&D until we leave work, which actually is one of the most fun parts of a project, if you ask me. And for this project in specific, we had a huge research and development phase. Basically, the whole project was that, because we weren't asked to deliver a set of images or movies. We ended up doing so, but we weren't even asked to do that. And this is just the dailies folder from the first production half or so. And as you can see, there are like a lot of images. I think my screen is really small. Yours is probably bigger if you look at that. It's 714 images, which we were able to generate in just a few weeks. Because even though we are a small team with this project, we were working on this with 4 people. But as I said, since we're working with cinema, we can iterate incredibly quickly, and it really feels like working with the software instead of working against the software. So basically, I now want to show you some of my favorite R&D. This is stuff from the very first day where we were really simply trying to take UI elements and visualize them in 3D and try to envision how they could move and how they could adapt, because that's basically the whole point of the MaterialYou UI system that we were asked to build a visual language for. It's that pretty much, if you think about it, it's pretty much exactly what we do as well. They build a design system for the UI so the user can adapt it to their own needs, but it still can't break the rules Google predefined. So it still always looks on brand for Google, but the user can pretty much do decisions on their own as well. And that's what we try to visualize for most of the R&D we did. We try to find ways to showcase that the user can interact with the software, that the user can decide on how their Android phone should look like and should behave. And for that, we basically tried a lot of different directions. For us, it was really important that everything we did looked rather playful and friendly, because after all, that's pretty much the image Google wants to send out. So what was quite amazing was back then, I think, at least for us, the new cloth system was kind of new. I think it wasn't really new, but for us, it was really new. And we had an amazing time playing around with it for the first time. And basically, all of us took like 4 days of just doing stuff you can see there, just like playing around and seeing what comes out of it. Because especially when working with cloth, it's so easy to make something look playful and friendly. So that was nice. But we also try to take shapes of the UI system and bring them into real life scenarios. For example, the plates you can see on the top left, they are basically, we try to resemble these like UI buttons you usually have on pretty much every operating system on a smartphone, where there usually is like a small circle in there, and then you can just toggle it on and off again, and it's super fun, and you toggle it on and off and on and off and on and off. So we found that to be a really interesting UI element and tried to play around with that, and a really simple exploration like the one you can see right there then eventually leads to something like this, which actually ended up being one of the final deliverables we sent to Google. And looking at this, it was still really important for us to find a way to bring UI elements to a real world scenario without it looking like kind of uncanny or like a future that we personally wouldn't want to live in. Because usually if you try to Google UI system of the future, you might see a kitchen like this, and then there are like glowing lines and glowing UI elements, and everything looks kind of horrible, to be honest, and kind of like a bleak dystopian future that we personally don't want to live in. So every time we try to bring something digital into a real life scenario, we try to really focus on something playful and on something that we actually would like to live in 30 years or something. And also, this approach helps us to tell a similar story between the different worlds we were trying to establish. This was also one of the really early tests we did. This basically could resemble anything. This could be like a color swatch that you can just spin around, or this could be buttons that you can tweak to be triangular. We try to not have boundaries on what we try out, and more like just see what comes out of it. In contrast to a lot of like realistic environments we built, we also had the task to look at the UI in a really macro perspective. For Google, it was important to showcase that even the most tiny UI element consists of so many hours of work and so many little details that then make it work perfectly in the sense of a UI system, that we try to find a way to visualize this amount of work and all of those details in the smallest UI elements. This, if you can, I mean, you probably can see it. It's also the pill-shaped UI button that we then tried to just fill with like small atoms, as we called them, because the whole world Google was trying to establish was also called atomic unit, because the UI elements are built of atomic units. And this was really fun to work on, in contrast to the realistic pieces we did. And this one also was a lot of fun to develop, because as probably all of you remember as well, back like 6 or 7 years ago, when you wanted to have like 4 million high resolution spheres filling your scene, I don't know, that it wasn't fun back then, but nowadays it actually is a lot of fun. We tried out the new multi-cloner setting in Cinema 4D's Cloner, which I think at that time wasn't new as well, but for us it was new. We tried it out for the first time then, and it was amazing to see how quickly we can navigate scenes, how quickly we can do look depth, and how quickly we can iterate even on those scenes where there are millions and millions of particles. Most of them you can't even see because they're hidden in the depth of field, but trust me, There are a lot of them. And apart from like realistic environments and atomic unit macro shots, we also obviously, as I already showed you, try to take elements from the UI system and bridge them into a kind of real world scenario and try to give them some form of character. For example, with the knob on the top right, we try to make it really playful, and we try to if the audience sees it, that they want to play around with it, that they want to touch it, that they want to interact with it, because that's ultimately what the goal was for the design system we wanted to create. But there's also the calculator. This is just the really very, very first exploration of this. For this, the idea was that we wanted to showcase how the user could possibly adapt the interface to their own needs. And those two shots, even though they look really simple in this slide, basically evolved into a set of final deliverables as well. There's this knob, which I'm still a huge fan. Oh, now that's really that's uncomfortable. I wanted to avoid that. Which I still really like, but my personal favorite of this whole project actually is the calculator, because we were working with an amazing animator. He's called Dominic Grage, and we were working with him at Foam Studio back then as well. And basically everything that needs to be animated, we just call him because it doesn't get better than what he does. And basically he set up this scene. And personally, this is one of my favorites. The way the calculator behaves and the character it just has is really amazing. And this developed even further, though. We then ended up building something like this, which then kind of is the pinnacle of an adaptable UI system, I would say, because it's not playing, is it? Is it playing for you? Oh no, I skipped in the wrong direction. Now it's playing. And it's not playing. It should be playing. Okay, maybe not. And it's not. Okay. Anyways, there's this calculator and the calendar and the music player, and basically all of them are just changing their proportions and sliding left to right and top to bottom, and it all looks really fun. I would love to show you, but I'm not allowed to apparently. But don't worry, there will be a shot of this in one of the final films I will show you at the end. Oh well. And as I said, we were playing around a lot with Cinema's new cloth tools, but also with volume builders, because we felt like, despite these being super accessible tools and basically a frame like those, everyone in this room could easily create because there are no crazy technical setups involved. It still worked perfectly well to establish the design system that we wanted to establish and to find a way of communicating the comfort and friendliness. These are also some more really simple explorations we had, and then also those evolved into something way more elaborate, just like this one. This was actually a first day test of me, which, I mean, I think all of you have on their phone like this photo gallery where you can just like swipe through. And this was the most basic try ever to build something along the lines of that in 3D. It doesn't even work properly if you take a look at it, but we were so intrigued by how this is working that we actually ended up building exactly that into 2 of our animations, which, if you put it into a context, really works well suddenly. We also did this, which unfortunately didn't really match the design system we were going to establish, but it's still a shot I really, really like, so I wanted to show you as well. I rediscovered it while going through the dailies to prepare the presentation. I almost forgot about this, and then I saw it and I was like, oh nice, I want to include this one as well. So here we are. But we also did a lot of weird stuff, a lot of hand animation, because that's still a lot of fun to us. And we obviously also used a lot of the dynamics and simulation tools that Cinema 4D offers to then finally land on a design system that really works for Google as a company. This was really weird, but I somehow liked it. And basically, after we did this huge R&D phase, we kind of knew what concept we wanted to go for. And that's the most important thing when working on projects like this, because once you've arrived on a concept, you then want to pair it with a solid design system and to really polish the design system in order to make sure that the abstract story you are trying to tell is conveying really the correct message. Because all of the R&D you could do doesn't use anything if you, in the end, produce a set of images or movies or films for whatever use, and the audience sees it, and it sees something completely different than what you intended it to do. So if you want to write a story of comfort and joy and playfulness, just like we wanted to do for Google Design, you need to create a design system that only uses shapes that convey these emotions to ensure that the story will always be told with the right words in mind. And that was basically what we then tried to pursue for the rest of the project. After we did the R&D and we knew, or we kind of knew what we wanted to do concept-wise, we could then focus on how to make everything work together and tie it together in the design system. And this is just a glimpse of the images we delivered in the end to Google Design, which we're incredibly proud of, and it was one of the most fun projects we've had in a while. And the funniest thing was, as I already mentioned, we weren't even asked to deliver a set of images, and we weren't even asked to deliver an animation of any sorts, but somehow we ended up doing all of those funny video vignettes, as we call them, like those short, a few second animation clips that work really, really well by their own. But somewhere along the process, we got intrigued, and we're like, we have some time left. What if we do like a short hero animation for the new Android lock screen? So that's exactly what we did. And as you can see, a good design system actually is comfort food for your brain. Because a design system comforts our brain in suggesting a systematic baseline behind what it sees. Quite similar to the categorization I was talking beforehand when going wild about tables. Because it makes things predictable. A design system makes things predictable, and it takes away the room for questions and for false interpretations. After all, it doesn't leave the audience, in this case, hopefully you, it doesn't leave you behind having a weird feeling and an awkward feeling and not quite knowing what you just saw. But maybe we are like you and we quite like weird stuff as well. So we also did an R&D reel that's not like supremely weird, but there are weird bits and pieces in it. So I want to show you this as well. To finish it off, I would still like to say thank you to Maxon for making this happen, for doing this giveaway so nobody left the room.